Hello. Hello, this is Piotr speaking again, and that is Quasar Training Part 2, the updated version from 2020 on Linux. In the Part 1, we've gone through creating Quasar projects, building, running them, and connecting a simple OPC-UA client. And in this part, we will have a first look on the concept of the Quasar architecture. And we'll have a first look on the Quasar design, and we'll work a bit on the design. We'll develop the design a bit, trying to add some classes and organizing the classes. And then we'll see what's the design and configuration, so what's the relation between them. And there will be a few takeaways. So the basic concepts of Quasar architecture. So we have Quasar design, and the design is the entry point for the creators of OPC-UA servers, and consequently of corresponding OPC-UA clients, and so on and so forth. And the design is written in a language describing software components with OPC-UA interface. And just to make it clear here, it's written means you will write the design in a language that we have defined. And a Quasar design is per every server type, which means every Quasar project that you started, like the one we started in the part 1 of this training, has its own Quasar design. Why Quasar design is relevant? So Quasar primarily addresses C++ based server developments, and having Quasar design, we can apply model-driven engineering, which means we can, for instance, do code generation or generation of other artifacts for which the design is the primary input, the primary source of data. And Quasar design uses some basic elements to model the systems that your server will serve. For instance, classes, variables, methods, and things like this, they will be described along this training. So what does this mean in practice? In practice, the design is stored in a XML file in your Quasar server project in the design directory. So let's have a look at this. So I think this is where we left in the part 1. This is the project that we created in part 1. So I will have a look into design XML, and we see there is such an XML file. It's about empty at this stage because we didn't add anything to it yet. Now what's relevant is it has a schema called design XSD, which is in the same directory. And it can be visualized by Quasar tools. So let's try to do that, because we'll use visualization many times in near future. So the way we do it is Quasar Pi generate diagram, and then I use my PDF viewer of choice to look at this diagram. So what we see for this moment is something called root, and this corresponds to the objects folder of the server we'll be building. So far we don't see any class here, and that's pretty much expected because we didn't have we haven't yet added any class, so that's fine. But in future we'll use this tool to visualize the design as we develop it, as the server grows. So to work on the design, to develop the design, it's best to use schema-aware XML editor, and our recommendation for this is Eclipse with the Eclipse XML tools. So basically, if you use a C++ version, CDT version of Eclipse, usually it has XML tools, is our recommendation. So let's try it. So what I'll do is I'm starting Eclipse. And then I do file, new project. I select C++ project. And then what I'll do, instead of creating this in the workspace of Eclipse, I'll simply use the same directory as where I've created our Quasar project in the part 1 of this training. And I will even reuse the same name. And I'll say it's an empty project. It doesn't really matter much for Eclipse because it can handle this easily, so that's not really any problem. So there I can look inside this. Basically, we've already opened the design in some console text viewer. So this is how it looks like in Eclipse XML tools. Now, pay attention. You should see the proper content model here. So for instance, it's saying that design can have multiple classes and the root element. If you don't see the content, it means something's wrong with your Eclipse. So don't go beyond this point. Will not really solve anything. First, solve the problem with Eclipse. Seeing content means that you can edit this file pretty easily. For instance, you can do add child, and Eclipse will actually tell you what you can put here, what you can remove, what you cannot remove. So it becomes really easy. Okay, so that was on how I work with Quasar design. Now let's pick some easy examples. So I thought that we could try to make an OPC-UA server for something like an intelligent motor. A motor, I think, is a nice example of control systems because it has controls, so you can control the motor, for instance, turn on, turn off, change speed, or do things like this. You can also monitor it. So you can, for instance, query what's the current rotational speed, or I don't know, the power consumption, or the status, or things like this. So it has the information exchange in both ways, which makes it a nice example for studying Quasar. So what I'll do is I will add a class called motor to my OPC-UA server. So right click on the design, by default Eclipse is proposing me to add one variable. I don't want to do this at this stage, so I remove that. And I will organize this class such that it belongs directly under root of the server, which means on root I will do add child has objects, and I will say it's motor, and saved. Okay, so let's first see how it looks on our visualization. And maybe I leave it in the background. So now we see that there's lots of elements which we borrowed from the UML notation. So now you can tell that under root there might be any number of motors. Voila, it's kind of expected. So each change of Quasar design requires rebuild of the server. Okay, each change of Quasar design requires a rebuild of the server, but don't worry, usually the Quasar design change is only in the active development of the project. Voila. So in the previous part we've learned how to build a Quasar-based OPC-UA server. So Quasar build, let's execute it. Okay, and like in the previous time, we can start the server, run UA expert, and add the server, and connect. And we see no change yet. Under objects, there's really nothing. Why? Because what we did adding motor was adding a Quasar class. We did not add any instance yet. So this brings us to what is design, what's configuration. Design is where you declare types of things. That means classes. And here I find an error. So the types are used to build the server, but they're not used for running it. While on contrary, the instances of types, which means objects, with the configuration data is what you put in the configuration, which is used and loaded at runtime, and you can have multiple configuration files for the same Quasar server project, which means if your server is a nice generic thing, then you can make one Quasar server project, reuse it on multiple places in your control system or for multiple clients, and each of the clients will have a different config file, right? Okay, so let's add an instance of a motor. How do I do that? I do that via the configuration file, and the configuration file usually is found along where the executable is. So build bin, I find the config file here. This is the default config file that the Quasar-based OPC-UA server will load at runtime. So let's open it. And what I can see here is, again, this has a defined content model, and the content model is derived from the design. And why I'm saying that? Because, for instance, I can see motor here as the third term, which definitely comes from the design, and you will see that when we start elaborating on the design. Okay, so let's add 2 motors, let's say. I decided to add 2 motors because I want to tell you that we really have one type, but we can have any number of instances. They need to have distinct names, but voila, that's it. So I'm saving the config. I don't have to rebuild the server because I only change the configuration. So changing the configuration does not require any rebuild of the server. The configuration is loaded at runtime. So I'm starting my server right now. And I go to UA Expert, I rebrowse, and I see M1, M2, there is nothing in those objects, those are basically empty objects, but at least I see my motor 1 and motor 2. Okay, so few takeaways is that the Quasar design is of primary importance for Quasar server developers. So this is a kind of a language. You use a kind of language to express what is your control system for which you're making the OPC-UA server using Quasar. So the languages that use classes and the has objects, and in future we use more and more of those elements. You should use a good editor for editing this. Our recommendation is Eclipse. And that instances of classes are in the configuration files, and that design is used for building, while configuration is used for running. Those are the takeaways. So thank you for your attention. That was the part 2 of Quasar Training 2020 update on Linux. Thank you.